On November 25th, 1970, one of Japan's most celebrated novelists walked into a military headquarters in Tokyo, took a general hostage, and tried to spark a coup. When it failed, he knelt on the floor, plunged a blade into his own stomach, and died in a spreading pool of blood while news cameras captured everything. The world watched in horror as an ancient ritual suddenly came back to life. But here's what most people don't know. The man assigned to mercifully end his suffering struck 3 times and missed, twice hitting his shoulder instead of his neck. For agonizing seconds, the novelist, already disemboweled, endured even more torture before someone else finally stepped in to finish what should have been a single, swift blow. This wasn't supposed to happen. For centuries, this ritual had been perfected, refined into an art form where everything followed precise protocols. Yet even in 1970, with all that accumulated knowledge, it still went horribly wrong. That's the thing about seppuku that nobody tells you. Behind every serene description of samurai dying with perfect composure lies a brutal reality. Men cutting through their own abdominal walls, exposing their intestines, enduring pain that makes grown warriors scream despite centuries of training to remain silent. And the so-called mercy blow that was supposed to end their suffering quickly, it failed more often than you'd think. Tonight, we're going to strip away the Hollywood myths and the romanticized legends to reveal what seppuku really was. And I promise you, the truth is stranger, more complex, and far more disturbing than anything you've seen in movies. Because here's the twist that will change how you see this entire practice. By the time seppuku reached its most refined form in peaceful Edo Japan, most samurai never actually cut themselves at all. They would reach for a fan, just a folded paper fan, and the instant their fingers touched it, their head would be severed. The legendary samurai ritual of disembowelment had become, in many cases, nothing more than elaborate theater. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how warriors opening their own bellies became cultural theater, we need to go back 8 centuries to a battlefield in 1180, where an elderly warrior poet was about to make a choice that would echo through Japanese history forever. Let's start with the words themselves, because even the terminology reveals something unexpected. In the West, most people know this practice as harakiri, belly cutting. It sounds brutal, because it is. But in Japan, the formal term used in official documents, legal proceedings, and educated discourse was seppuku. Here's the interesting part. Both words use the exact same Chinese characters, just in reverse order with different pronunciations. It's the same act, but seppuku carried the weight of ceremony, of ritual, of something that transcended mere violence. And here's what samurai believed, or at least what they were taught to believe. Cutting open the abdomen wasn't just a method of dying. Japanese tradition held that the belly housed a person's true spirit, their genuine emotions, their very essence. To open one's hara was to literally expose your inner self, to prove you had nothing to hide. The pain, the agony, the unflinching endurance of it all, that was the demonstration. It showed you meant every word you'd ever spoken about honor and loyalty. But between what people believed and what actually happened, there's a gap we'll be exploring all night. Because seppuku as practiced was never quite as clean, noble, or voluntary as the legends suggest. The practice emerged in a Japan consumed by war, where power shifted like sand and survival often depended on maintaining one's honor in the eyes of peers, lords, and enemies alike. In that world, capture meant torture, interrogation, and a death devoid of dignity. Defeat meant disgrace, not just for oneself, but for one's entire family line, potentially for generations. Against this backdrop, the ability to choose one's own death, to orchestrate the manner and moment of one's end, represented a form of power that even defeat could not strip away. But seppuku was more than a battlefield expediency. Over centuries, it evolved into something both simpler and more complex. A codified ritual, a legal institution, a cultural touchstone, and ultimately, a symbol of an entire way of life. It became inextricably linked with bushido, the unwritten code that governed samurai conduct. It became a punishment reserved for the warrior class, considered a privilege that spared them the ignominy of common execution. It became a path to redemption, a way to restore honor through the ultimate sacrifice. The question that haunts us now, across the centuries: what kind of society creates such a practice? What psychological and spiritual framework makes voluntary disembowelment not just acceptable, but admirable? How did something so fundamentally violent become so deeply ritualized, transformed into an art form with its own aesthetics, its own poetry, its own terrible beauty? These are not easy questions, and as we move through this story, you'll find there are no simple answers. The history of seppuku is a history of contradictions, violence and refinement, honor and coercion, choice and obligation, individual agency and social pressure. It's a practice that was simultaneously celebrated and feared, voluntary and commanded, ancient and ever-evolving. What we can say with certainty is this: seppuku was real. It happened again and again across centuries of Japanese history. Men opened their own bellies with blades of folded steel. Women cut their own throats rather than face capture. Entire groups performed mass ritual suicide to follow their lords into death or avoid the shame of surrender. And through it all, Japanese society watched, recorded, memorialized, and sometimes mandated these acts. Tonight, we'll trace this practice from its misty origins in the late Heian period through its formalization in the age of the samurai, from its transformation into legal punishment to its persistence in the modern era. We'll meet the individuals who chose this death, understand the philosophical framework that made it meaningful, and examine the ritual in all its precise, horrifying detail. We'll explore the role of the kaishakunin, the assistant who delivered the final blow. We'll hear the stories of women who practiced their own forms of ritual suicide. And we'll follow the practice to its twilight in the 20th century, when a celebrated novelist shocked the world by reviving an ancient ritual for one last, dramatic performance. This is not a celebration of seppuku. Neither is it a simple condemnation. Instead, we'll try to understand it as those who practiced it understood it, as a meaningful act within a specific cultural context, as a solution to problems we can barely imagine, as a practice that reveals fundamental truths about honor, shame, loyalty, and the human relationship with death itself. The story begins over 8 centuries ago, in a Japan tearing itself apart. Origins and early history, when warriors chose their own death. The exact moment when seppuku entered Japanese history is harder to pin down than you might expect. You'll sometimes read about a bandit named Hakamadare who supposedly cut open his own stomach in 988 after being captured. It makes for a neat origin story. But here's the problem. The account was recorded generations after it supposedly happened, and Hakamadare wasn't even a samurai. He was a criminal. The seppuku we recognize, the ritual tied to warrior honor, came later, and under very different circumstances. Most historians point to the late Heian period, roughly between 1050 and 1185. This was an era when Japan's old order was crumbling. The imperial court in Kyoto, which had ruled for centuries, was losing its grip. Out in the provinces, armed men who had once served as muscle for aristocrats were forming their own power structures. These were the first samurai, though the term wouldn't be standardized for years yet. They were warriors gaining independence, and with independence came new problems about honor, shame, and how to die when dying became necessary. Then came the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, 5 years of brutal conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans. This war was about to reshape Japan entirely. The winner would establish the first shogunate, the first military government, fundamentally changing who held power. And it's during this war that we get our first clear, documented case of ritual suicide by a warrior. His name was Minamoto no Yorimasa, and here's what makes his story fascinating. He wasn't some young hothead seeking glory. He was in his 70s, an accomplished warrior, yes, but also a celebrated poet. When you think samurai, you probably don't picture an elderly man who wrote verse, but that's exactly what the first documented seppuku practitioner was. At the Battle of Uji in 1180, Yorimasa found himself on the losing side. Taira forces were overwhelming his position. Capture was inevitable, and based on what we know of warfare at that time, capture meant interrogation, likely torture, certainly execution, but on the enemy's terms, in the enemy's time, at their pleasure. So Yorimasa made a different choice. The historical account tells us he first composed a death poem. Like a fossil tree from which we gather no flowers, sad has been my life, faded no fruit to produce. Then he plunged his sword into his abdomen. No assistant to end his suffering quickly. No mercy blow. Just the blade, the cut, and however many hours it took to die from blood loss. By all accounts, he maintained composure throughout. Now, here's what's important to understand. This wasn't the first time a warrior had killed himself rather than face capture. What made this different was how Yorimasa did it, and how the story was told afterward. The poem, the deliberate choice of method, the reported composure. This became the template, the model that other warriors would follow. Shortly after, and the exact chronology is debated, came Minamoto no Tamatomo. Exiled to the island of Oshima around 1177 after a failed rebellion, Tamatomo apparently attempted to take over the island. When that failed and forces came to suppress him, he too chose ritual suicide. Whether this occurred before or after Yorimasa's death isn't entirely clear from surviving records, but the pattern was establishing itself. But why this particular method? Why the abdomen specifically? Here's where we move from documented facts to cultural interpretation. Traditional Japanese medicine and philosophy, heavily influenced by Chinese thought, suggested that the abdomen was the seat of a person's spirit, their genuine emotions, their essence. The word hara, belly, also came to mean one's true feelings or inner nature. Based on this worldview, opening one's belly could be understood as literally revealing one's inner self, proving sincerity in a way that no words could match. But there may have been more practical considerations too. A warrior facing capture by enemies who would torture him for information had limited options for quick suicide. Cutting the throat could be quick, but it could also be botched, leaving you choking on your own blood, but not dead. Falling on your sword, Roman style, left too much to chance. The abdominal cut, for all its agony, was unmistakable. If you had the willpower to drive a blade into your own belly and drag it across, opening yourself up, nobody could question your commitment. The pain itself became proof of courage. And let's be clear about the pain. We're talking about cutting through the abdominal wall, tough muscle, and connective tissue. Then slicing horizontally through your intestines, possibly 7 to 8 meters of them, packed into your abdominal cavity. Without modern anesthesia, without morphine, nothing but willpower between you and the worst pain most people can imagine. During these early centuries, the practice was crude compared to what it would become. There was no elaborate ceremony, no formal etiquette, no specialized assistant. A warrior who chose this death might be alone on a battlefield, surrounded by enemies, or in a castle about to fall. He would take his sword, either the long tachi or a shorter blade if that's what he had, and drive it into his belly. The cut would be horizontal, from left to right across the abdomen. Then, if he had the strength and will, he might cut upward, or stab himself in the throat, or position himself to fall on the blade. It was brutal. It was painful beyond imagining. And by all accounts, death was neither quick nor certain from the abdominal wound alone. A man might linger for hours, his intestines exposed, slowly bleeding out. But that, in a sense, was the point. The ability to endure such pain without crying out, without showing weakness, without pleading for help, that was the demonstration of warrior spirit. That was what separated the samurai from ordinary men. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, Japan entered a new phase. The Minamoto clan's victory in the Genpei War led to the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1185. For the first time, military men held the real power in Japan, ruling through the shogun while the emperor remained a figurehead in Kyoto. This was the beginning of Japan's long feudal period, and it marked the ascendancy of the warrior class. With warriors now at the top of the social hierarchy, their customs and codes took on new significance. Seppuku began to spread beyond the battlefield. It became a way for warriors to take responsibility for failures, to prove loyalty to a lord, to avoid shame in situations where honor had been compromised. The practice began to formalize, developing rules and expectations. During the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333, several important developments occurred. First, the concept of loyalty to one's lord became paramount. The relationship between a samurai and his daimyo, the feudal lord he served, was the foundation of the entire social structure. A samurai owed his lord absolute loyalty, even unto death. This principle would shape seppuku in fundamental ways. Second, the influence of Zen Buddhism began to permeate warrior culture. Zen, with its emphasis on self-discipline, acceptance of death, and focus on the present moment, provided a philosophical framework that made ritual suicide not just acceptable, but spiritually meaningful. The Zen concept of living each moment as if it might be your last, of being prepared for death at any time, resonated deeply with warriors whose lives were perpetually at risk. Third, the early outlines of bushido, the warrior's code, started to coalesce. These were not yet the formalized principles that would be written down in later centuries, but the core ideas were taking shape. Honor above all, loyalty unto death, courage in the face of any hardship, and a willingness to die for one's beliefs or one's lord. During this period, we also see seppuku begin to serve new social functions. A defeated daimyo might be offered the chance to commit seppuku as part of a peace agreement. This served multiple purposes. It removed the defeated leader from the picture. It demonstrated magnanimity on the part of the victor, saving the defeated from the humiliation of public execution, and it could prevent ongoing resistance from the defeated clan's retainers. The great unifier Toyotomi Hideyoshi would later use this tactic repeatedly. The Warring States period, from 1467 to 1568, saw seppuku become even more common. Japan descended into near constant warfare as daimyo fought for control of provinces and ultimately for control of the country. In this brutal era, defeat in battle was common, castles fell regularly, and warriors frequently faced situations where honorable death seemed the only option. It was during this time that an important innovation emerged: the idea that a military leader could save his followers through his own death. If a castle was under siege and defeat was certain, the commander might offer to commit seppuku if his soldiers and their families would be spared. This transformed seppuku from purely personal honor into a tool of negotiation and sacrifice for others. One of the most famous examples occurred in 1582. Shimizu Muneharu commanded Takamatsu Castle in Bichu Province. The great Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then still known as Hashiba Hideyoshi, laid siege to the castle and flooded it by diverting a river. The situation became desperate. Hideyoshi offered terms. If Muneharu would commit seppuku, everyone else in the castle would be spared. Muneharu accepted. He dressed in formal clothing, had himself rowed out onto the flooded waters in a small boat, and there, in full view of both armies, he opened his abdomen and cut deeply. Then he stabbed himself in the throat and fell forward into the water. The castle garrison was indeed spared, and Munaharu's death became legendary as an example of a lord sacrificing himself for his people. By the late 16th century, as Japan moved toward reunification under first Oda Nobunaga, then Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, seppuku had become a fully established part of warrior culture. It was understood, expected, and in certain circumstances, virtually required. A samurai who failed his lord, who brought shame to his family, or who found himself in an impossible position, would seriously consider this final option. But the practice was still evolving. The most dramatic changes would come in the next era, when Japan entered a long period of peace, and seppuku transformed from a desperate battlefield measure into a formal, highly ritualized procedure, and ultimately into a form of legal execution. The philosophy of bushido. Understanding the warrior's way. To truly understand seppuku, we must understand the philosophical framework that made it meaningful. That framework was bushido, the way of the warrior. Though the term bushido itself wasn't widely used until the 17th century, and many aspects weren't formally codified until even later, the core principles were developing throughout the medieval period. These principles shaped not just how samurai fought, but how they lived, how they viewed themselves, and ultimately, how they died. Bushido was never a single, written code like a legal document or religious scripture. It was more fluid than that, more organic. Different regions, different time periods, even different schools of thought emphasized different aspects. But certain core values remained consistent, forming the ethical backbone of the samurai class. At the very heart of Bushido stood the concept of honor. Not honor as we might think of it in modern Western culture, not merely reputation or the respect of others, but something more fundamental. For the samurai, honor was the measure of one's worth as a human being. It was the alignment between one's inner self and one's actions. It was living according to principles so deeply held that death was preferable to their violation. This wasn't abstract philosophy. In practical terms, a samurai's honor determined his place in society, his lord's trust in him, his family's standing, his children's prospects. But more than that, honor was how a samurai understood himself. It was his identity. To live without honor was, quite literally, to cease being a samurai. Better to cease being alive. Closely related to honor was the principle of loyalty. The bond between a samurai and his lord was absolute, transcending even family ties. A samurai served his daimyo with complete devotion, following orders without question, protecting his lord with his life if necessary. This wasn't blind obedience. Not exactly. It was more like a sacred relationship, almost spiritual in nature. The Lord provided purpose, protection, and a place in the social order. The samurai gave everything in return. When we read about samurai committing seppuku to follow their lord into death, even when not ordered to do so, it's this principle of loyalty at work. The practice was called oibara, or tsuifuku, and it reflected the belief that the bond between lord and retainer didn't end with death. Even in the afterlife, a loyal samurai would serve his master. To continue living after one's lord had died could be seen as a betrayal of that sacred bond. Courage, of course, was central to Bushido, but samurai courage wasn't just about fearlessness in battle. It encompassed the courage to make difficult decisions, the courage to stand by one's principles, even at great personal cost, and most importantly, the courage to face death with composure. A samurai was expected to be ready to die at any moment. He should live each day as if it might be his last. This didn't mean being reckless. Rather, it meant achieving a kind of Zen acceptance of mortality that freed one to act without hesitation. This is where the influence of Zen Buddhism becomes apparent. Zen teachings permeated samurai culture from the Kamakura period onward. The emphasis on living in the present moment, on accepting reality without resistance, on seeing through illusions to the truth beneath. These ideas resonated powerfully with warriors who faced death regularly. Zen meditation practices helped samurai achieve the mental discipline and emotional control expected of them. The connection to Zen also helped frame death, and ritual death in particular, as something more than mere ending. In Zen thought, the ego, the sense of separate self, is understood as an illusion. To die consciously, with full awareness and acceptance, could be seen as a kind of enlightenment, a final letting go of the illusion of self. Seppuku, performed with proper mindfulness and courage, became not just an honorable death, but a spiritual practice. Confucianism added other crucial elements to bushido. The Confucian emphasis on proper relationships, hierarchical order, and moral rectitude shaped how samurai understood their place in society. Filial piety, respect for elders, the importance of education, and self-cultivation. These Confucian values became part of the warrior ethic. However, there was a crucial twist. For the samurai, loyalty to one's lord superseded even filial piety. If serving one's lord required actions that brought hardship to one's parents, that was an acceptable, even necessary sacrifice. Confucianism also contributed to the samurai's sense of duty. The concept of giri, often translated as duty or obligation, was fundamental. A samurai had countless duties to his lord, to his family, to his comrades, to his name, to the principles of bushido itself. These duties created a complex web of obligations that guided action. When duties conflicted, as they sometimes did, resolving that conflict with integrity was its own kind of honor. Shinto, Japan's native spiritual tradition, contributed elements as well. The reverence for ancestors, the concept of purification, the emphasis on ritual and proper form, all influenced how bushido developed. The idea that the spirits of the dead could watch over the living, judge them, even influence events, made one's legacy after death a matter of spiritual significance. To die well, to leave behind a story that would honor one's ancestors and serve as an example to descendants. This was important in ways that went beyond earthly concerns. The bushido principles that most directly relate to seppuku include rectitude or justice, often described as the ability to decide on a course of action based on reason, and to act on that decision without wavering. For the samurai, this meant having the moral clarity to know when death was required, and the fortitude to carry it through. It meant dying when to die was right, and striking when to strike was right. Benevolence and compassion might seem at odds with a warrior ethos, but they were part of bushido. A samurai was expected to be strong, but not cruel, victorious, but not vicious. He should protect those weaker than himself and use his power justly. This principle helped balance the violence inherent in warfare with a sense of moral responsibility. Self-discipline and self-control were absolute requirements. A samurai must master his emotions, control his desires, maintain composure in all situations. He should never show weakness, never complain, never allow personal feelings to compromise his duty. This extended to physical control as well. The samurai was expected to endure pain, hardship, and suffering without flinching. This is where the connection to seppuku becomes most clear. The ability to cut open one's own abdomen, to endure unimaginable pain without crying out, to maintain composure and dignity even as death approached. This was the ultimate demonstration of self-control. It was proof of one's mastery over the body, over pain, over the instinctive fear of death. In a culture that valued such control above nearly everything else, seppuku became the ultimate test and the ultimate statement. During the peaceful Edo period, from 1603 to 1867, bushido evolved further. With no major wars to fight, the samurai class had to redefine itself. Warrior skills were still practiced, but they became more about discipline and self-cultivation than preparation for battle. The emphasis shifted from martial prowess to moral character, from winning battles to living virtuously, from dying gloriously in combat to serving dutifully in administration. It was during this period that the most influential writings on bushido appeared. The most famous is Hagakure, compiled by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 1700s. This text, based on conversations between Yamamoto and his disciple, contains the famous line, "The way of the samurai is found in death." The book emphasizes that a samurai should always be prepared to die, should indeed imagine his own death each morning, so that when death comes, he can face it with proper composure. Hagakure presents an idealized, even extreme version of bushido. It reflects nostalgia for an earlier, more martial age, written as it was in a time when most samurai were bureaucrats rather than warriors. But its influence on how later generations understood bushido cannot be overstated. Another crucial text is Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written in 1899 by Nitobe Inazo. This book, significantly, was written in English and addressed to a Western audience. Nitobe was trying to explain Japanese culture to foreigners, and in doing so, he presented Bushido as a coherent ethical system comparable to European chivalry. His work was enormously influential both in the West and in Japan itself, shaping how people understood and discussed the warrior code. However, we must be careful here. Nitobe was writing at a specific moment in Japanese history, during the Meiji era, when Japan was rapidly modernizing and seeking respect from Western powers. His version of Bushido, while rooted in historical practices, was also somewhat romanticized and systematized. It presented Bushido as more uniform and more formally structured than it had been in practice during the feudal period. The Bushido Nitobe described emphasized 7 essential virtues: rectitude or justice, courage, benevolence, respect or politeness, honesty and sincerity, honor and loyalty. These were real principles that had guided samurai conduct, but the neat categorization was more Nitobe's construction than historical reality. What we can say with certainty is that by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Bushido had become a kind of national ethic in Japan, extended beyond the samurai class to all Japanese citizens. The Meiji government promoted Bushido values as a way to build national character and loyalty to the emperor. This had both positive effects, promoting discipline and duty, and tragic ones, as these same principles were weaponized during Japan's militaristic expansion in the early 20th century. The connection between Bushido and Seppuku was always intimate. Seppuku embodied Bushido principles in action. It demonstrated loyalty when loyalty demanded the ultimate sacrifice. It proved courage by facing the most difficult death imaginable. It maintained honor when honor had been compromised. It showed self-control through the mastery of pain. It was rectitude in action, making the difficult but correct decision and following through without hesitation. In a sense, Seppuku was Bushido distilled to its essence. Every value, every principle, every virtue that the warrior code emphasized found expression in this single act. That's why it became so central to samurai identity. It wasn't just one option among many. It was the ultimate test, the final proof of one's commitment to the way of the warrior. Understanding this philosophical framework helps us see seppuku not as some barbaric remnant of a violent age, but as a meaningful practice within a coherent worldview. To the samurai, seppuku made sense. It served important purposes. It resolved conflicts between competing duties. It offered a path to redemption when all other paths had closed. It transformed an ending into a statement, a defeat into a kind of victory, a personal failure into a public demonstration of virtue. We can debate whether such values were admirable or horrific, whether a culture that prized honor over life was noble or tragic. But we cannot understand seppuku without understanding the principles that made it meaningful to those who practiced it. The ritual, ceremony, symbolism, and brutal reality. Now we come to the practice itself in all its precise, terrible detail. By the early Edo period, seppuku had evolved from a desperate, battlefield measure into an elaborate ritual, codified and refined, with specific procedures, proper forms, and expected behaviors at every step. This is the version of seppuku most familiar from historical accounts and artistic depictions. But even in its most formalized state, the reality remained brutal. The ritual typically began long before the actual moment of death. When seppuku was obligatory, ordered by a lord or the shogunate as punishment, the condemned man would be informed and given time to prepare. This might be hours, or it might be days. When seppuku was voluntary, the decision itself came first, often after deep contemplation. Preparation involved both physical and spiritual elements. The samurai would bathe, a ritual of purification. The bath was usually cold water, which had a practical purpose. It would constrict blood vessels slightly, reducing the bleeding to come. After bathing, he would dress in a white kimono, the color of purity and death. White was significant. It symbolized the shedding of worldly attachments, the return to a state of spiritual cleanliness. In artistic depictions, we often see the condemned man in pristine white robes. And while this was accurate, it's important to note that this white would soon be stained completely red. Before the act itself, a final meal would often be served. This wasn't just practical sustenance, it was symbolic, a last taste of earthly pleasures, a final moment of normalcy before the irreversible step. The meal might include the samurai's favorite foods, served with all due ceremony. Then came one of the most important elements, the death poem. Called a jisei, this was a final statement, a last message to the world. The tradition of composing death poems was ancient in Japan, practiced by priests and nobles long before the samurai adopted it. For the samurai, the death poem served multiple purposes. It demonstrated cultural refinement, showing that the warrior was not merely a brute, but an educated person capable of poetic expression. It provided a way to express final thoughts about death, life, or the circumstances leading to this moment. And it served as a legacy, something that would outlive the body. These poems followed traditional forms, usually waka or haiku. The best death poems achieved a kind of serene acceptance, finding beauty or meaning in the moment of death itself. Many referenced nature, particularly cherry blossoms, which symbolized the transient nature of life in Japanese culture. Just as cherry blossoms bloom beautifully but fall quickly, so too does the samurai's life, bright, intense, and brief. Consider this death poem attributed to Oda Dokkan, a 15th century warrior poet who was ambushed and mortally wounded. Had I not known that I was dead already, I would have mourned my loss of life. Or this from Uesugi Kenshin, the great daimyo. Though whether it was actually composed at death or earlier is debated. Even a lifelong prosperity is but one cup of sake. A life of 49 years is passed in a dream. I know not what life is, nor death. Year in, year out, all but a dream. Both heaven and hell are left behind. I stand in the moonlit dawn, free from clouds of attachment. Not every samurai was a gifted poet, of course. The quality of death poems varied greatly. Some were profound, some were conventional, some were barely coherent. But the attempt itself mattered. It showed composure, presence of mind, and adherence to proper form, even at the moment of death. With the death poem composed, it was time for the act itself. The location varied depending on circumstances and social rank. A high-ranking daimyo might commit seppuku in his own residence or at the home of the official supervising the execution. A lower-ranking samurai might be assigned a room in the supervising official's compound or even directed to a specific outdoor location. For obligatory seppuku, there were established protocols about where the ritual should take place. The room would be prepared carefully. Tatami mats would be covered with white cloth. This served a purpose beyond symbolism. It made cleanup easier. Blood could be removed from cloth more readily than from tatami. Candle S might be lit. Incense burned. Everything was arranged to create a solemn atmosphere appropriate to the gravity of the occasion. The samurai would kneel in formal seiza position, sitting back on his heels, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. This required significant physical control. Maintaining this position through pain and blood loss demonstrated composure. Before him, placed on a small stand or directly on the cloth, was the blade. Most commonly, this would be a tanto, a dagger-like blade between 6 and 12 inches long. Sometimes, a wakizashi, the shorter of the two swords in a samurai's pair, might be used instead. The blade was exceptionally sharp, honed to a fine edge. It had to be sharp. A dull blade would make the cut more difficult and more painful. The blade was typically wrapped at one end with paper or cloth. This prevented the hand from slipping on blood and allowed a firmer grip when driving the blade in and drawing it across. Without this wrapping, the samurai might cut his own hand, making it difficult to complete the ritual. Behind the kneeling man stood the kaishakunin, the assistant. We'll discuss this role in detail shortly, but for now, understand that this person, usually a friend, relative, or fellow samurai of skill, held a drawn sword. His purpose was to end the suffering quickly through decapitation. He stood slightly to the left and behind, positioning himself for the strike to come. If this was an official, witnessed seppuku, others would be present. The representative of the authority ordering the execution, perhaps other officials, sometimes retainers, or family members. They would sit in formal positions at a respectful distance, observing in silence. The moment approached. The samurai would steady his breathing, prepare his mind. Then he would open his kimono to expose his abdomen. The white cloth would fall away, revealing bare skin. He would take the tanto in his right hand, blade pointing left. Some sources describe him holding it with both hands, others with the right hand alone. The grip was firm, but not tense. Control was everything. And then, the cut. He would position the point of the blade against his left side, just below the rib cage. With a decisive motion, he would drive the blade in, penetrating deep into the abdominal cavity. Then, the horizontal cut, drawing the blade across the abdomen from left to right. This was the defining characteristic of seppuku. The cut had to be deliberate, deep, and controlled. The pain was overwhelming. The abdominal cavity contains not just intestines, but numerous nerve endings. Cutting through the abdominal wall and into the viscera produced agony beyond most modern people's comprehension. Yet the samurai was expected to show no sign of suffering. No crying out, no grimacing, no loss of composure. The ability to endure this pain silently was part of the demonstration. Some samurai, those seeking to prove exceptional courage, would perform a second cut, vertical, creating a cross shape. This was called jumonji giri, literally cross-shaped cut. It required even greater physical control and endurance. After the horizontal cut, with his intestines already exposed and pain beyond imagining, the samurai would cut upward from the initial entry point, creating the vertical line of the cross. But even in seppuku's heyday, jumonji giri was rare. Most men, even brave ones, could barely manage the single horizontal cut. And increasingly, that single cut was deemed sufficient. What mattered was the attempt, the willingness, the courage to begin the act. Once the cut was made, the kaishakunin would act. We'll discuss his role more fully in the next section, but the basic function was clear. He would strike with his sword, cutting through the neck in a carefully executed blow that severed the spinal cord and major blood vessels, bringing death almost instantly. This was the act of mercy that spared the samurai prolonged suffering. The kaishakunin's strike was supposed to leave a small amount of skin at the front of the neck intact, so that the head wouldn't fly off, but would instead fall forward as if the samurai were bowing, or holding his own head in his lap. This detail was considered important for maintaining dignity. A head rolling across the floor was seen as disrespectful, undignified. In practice, achieving this perfect cut required enormous skill. The kaishakunin had to strike with enough force to cut through bone and tissue, severing the cervical vertebrae, while simultaneously stopping the blow before it completely separated the head. Many attempts failed. Sources record instances where the kaishakunin struck multiple times, or where the head did separate completely, or where the blow missed slightly, hitting the shoulder or jaw instead of the neck. By the late Edo period, the ritual had evolved further. The pain and difficulty of actual disembowelment led to a modification: fan seppuku, or ojibara. In this version, the samurai would reach for his tanto, or even just a folded fan representing the tanto, and the moment his hand touched the object, the kaishakunin would strike. The samurai never actually cut himself. It was purely symbolic, a gesture toward the traditional form, rather than the full performance of it. This might seem like a dilution of the practice, a softening, and in a sense it was, but consider the circumstances. By the late Edo period, Japan had been at peace for generations. Most samurai were administrators, not warriors. They had never faced combat, never dealt with physical wounds. The traditional form of seppuku, performed without modern anesthesia or medical knowledge, was almost unimaginably difficult. Fan seppuku allowed the ritual to continue, preserving the symbolism and the demonstration of courage. After all, kneeling and awaiting decapitation still required nerve, while acknowledging practical reality. There were also variations based on circumstance. Battlefield seppuku, when it still occurred, was far less elaborate. A defeated samurai might simply kneel among the dead, plunge his sword into his belly, and that was that. No white kimono, no death poem, no careful ceremony. Just a quick decision and a brutal act. Forced seppuku, ordered as punishment for crimes, could be elaborate or simple depending on the status of the condemned and the nature of his offense. A high-ranking samurai who had committed a serious but not disgraceful crime might be allowed the full ceremony. White robes, death poem, witnesses, a friend as kaishakunin. A lower-ranking samurai, or one whose crime was particularly shameful, might be stripped of these courtesies. One particularly harsh form was called naked seppuku. The condemned was not allowed the white kimono, but had to perform the act partially or completely unclothed. This was considered humiliating, a final indignity that marked the offense as particularly serious. The instruments used also varied. Most commonly, it was a tanto or wakizashi. But in some periods, samurai preparing for seppuku might commission special blades specifically for the purpose. These could be ornate, works of art in themselves, a final statement of the samurai's taste and status. Others preferred simple, unadorned blades, letting the act itself speak. In rare cases, particularly in later periods or unusual circumstances, other objects might be used symbolically. A wooden sword, painted red, to represent a blade. A folded fan, as we've mentioned. Even a piece of paper folded to represent a blade. By that point, the physical act of disembowelment had become secondary to the symbolic gesture of willingness to die. It's worth emphasizing the physical reality, though, because historical accounts and artistic depictions can make seppuku seem almost elegant, almost beautiful in a dark way. The truth was far messier. Blood loss was massive. The white robes, the white cloth on the floor would be completely soaked. The smell would be overwhelming. Blood, yes, but also the contents of the pierced intestines. If the cut was deep enough, the intestines themselves might spill partially out of the body. Even with a prompt kaishakunin strike, there would be convulsions, involuntary movements of the dying body. The heads of those who committed seppuku were sometimes preserved and displayed, though this was controversial. Some argued it was disrespectful to the dead. Others maintained it was part of confirming the death for official records. The head might be washed, prepared, and presented to the official who had ordered the seppuku, or to the lord whom the dead man had served. This was particularly common after group seppuku following major events. The disposal of the body followed specific protocols. The samurai would be buried with honor, his grave marked, his death recorded. His death poem would be preserved, copied, sometimes published. His name would be remembered, his story told. In a very real sense, seppuku offered a form of immortality. A samurai who died this way would be remembered far longer than one who died of old age or disease. The role of the kaishakunin, a sacred and terrible duty. Of all the roles in the drama of seppuku, none was more critical, more complex, or more psychologically burdensome than that of the kaishakunin. This was the person who stood behind the samurai, preparing to commit seppuku, sword drawn and ready, waiting for the moment when mercy and duty converged in a single, decisive stroke. To understand seppuku fully, we must understand this assistant's role, the incredible skill it required, and the profound emotional weight it carried. The word kaishakunin combines kaishaku, meaning roughly to assist or interpret, and nin, meaning person. The kaishakunin was the assistant in death, the one who would ensure that the samurai's final act achieved its intended purpose, a death that demonstrated courage, sincerity, and control. Without the kaishakunin, seppuku risked becoming a prolonged ordeal of suffering. With a skilled kaishakunin, death came swiftly after the initial demonstration of courage. Why was this role necessary? The answer lies in the harsh reality of self-inflicted abdominal wounds. Despite what historical dramas might suggest, cutting open one's belly was not immediately or reliably fatal. The abdominal cavity contains yards of intestines, various organs, major blood vessels, but the actual process of dying from such a wound could take hours. Blood loss would eventually bring unconsciousness and death, but the path there was one of excruciating pain and potential loss of composure. For a practice that was fundamentally about demonstrating courage and control, this presented a problem. A samurai might begin the ritual with perfect composure, make the initial cut with stoic dignity, and then collapse into writhing agony as shock and pain overcame willpower. This would defeat the entire purpose. The point of seppuku was to prove one's mastery over physical suffering, over the body's instinctive fear of death. If the final moments descended into screaming and thrashing, the demonstration failed. The kaishakunin solved this problem by delivering a quick, merciful decapitation immediately after the abdominal cut, or sometimes even as it was being made. The kaishakunin ensured that the samurai's demonstration of courage remained unblemished. It was an act of compassion, but also an act that served the ritual's purpose. The selection of a kaishakunin was crucial. This person needed to be skilled with a sword, trusted implicitly, and emotionally capable of bearing the burden. Most commonly, the person performing seppuku would choose a close friend, a fellow samurai of proven skill, or a trusted retainer. The relationship was important. This was not something you asked of a stranger. It was a profound act of trust and friendship. For voluntary seppuku, the choice was the dying samurai's to make. he might approach a friend days or weeks in advance, explaining his situation and requesting this final service. For obligatory seppuku, the authorities might assign a kaishakunin if the condemned had no one to call upon, though every effort was made to allow the samurai to choose his own assistant when possible. Being asked to serve as kaishakunin was considered an honor, but also a heavy burden. Historical accounts emphasize the psychological toll. One Japanese source from the Edo-period states, "From ages past, it has been considered an ill omen by samurai to be requested as kaishaku. The reason for this is that one gains no fame, even if the job is well done. Further, if one should blunder, it becomes a lifetime disgrace." This captures the complexity of the role. If everything went perfectly, if the kaishakunin delivered a clean, swift strike that brought instant death while maintaining the proper form of partial decapitation, he received little credit. It was expected. But if anything went wrong, if he missed his target, if he needed multiple strikes, if the head separated completely or the body fell in an undignified way, the blame fell entirely on him. He had failed his friend in the final moment. He had turned a sacred ritual into a butchery. The actual technique of kaishaku was complex and was preserved in the kata, the formal movements, of several schools of Japanese swordsmanship, particularly Iaido. These movements are still practiced today, though thankfully without the lethal conclusion. Studying these kata gives us insight into the care and precision involved. The kaishakunin would typically position himself slightly to the left rear of the samurai performing seppuku. This gave him the best angle for the cut, while keeping him out of the peripheral vision of the dying man. He would stand in most cases, or kneel in formal position if the circumstances required it. His sword would be drawn and held ready, but not in an aggressive stance. Everything about his posture should convey respect, solemnity, and control. As the samurai made his abdominal cut, the kaishakunin would watch carefully. The timing was crucial, and it was something agreed upon in advance. Some samurai wanted the strike to come immediately after the blade entered the abdomen, cutting short the pain. Others wanted to demonstrate their endurance, perhaps completing the full horizontal cut before the kaishakunin acted. Still others preferred to give a signal, a forward tilt of the head, reaching toward the tanto with the left hand, or some other prearranged gesture. When the moment came, the kaishakunin would raise his sword and bring it down in a specific cutting motion called daki-kubi, literally embraced head. The blade would strike at the back of the neck, cutting through skin, muscle, the cervical vertebrae, and the spinal cord. The force had to be sufficient to sever nearly everything, but the kaishakunin had to check the blow at the last instant, leaving a small band of skin and tissue at the front of the neck intact. This required extraordinary skill and control. Too light a blow, and the cut would be incomplete, requiring a second strike and causing additional suffering. Too heavy a blow, and the head would separate completely, considered disrespectful. The kaishakunin had to judge the precise amount of force needed, adjusting for his own strength, the type of sword he was using, the angle of the strike, even the build and posture of the person he was assisting. The position of that remaining strip of tissue was important too. It should be at the front of the neck, so that when the head fell forward after the strike, it would appear as if the samurai were looking down at his own body, or as if he were cradling his head in an embrace. This was considered dignified, proper. It maintained the aesthetic of control, even in death. Historical records are filled with accounts of kaishaku going wrong. In one famous incident, the kaishakunin missed entirely on his first strike, hitting the shoulder instead of the neck. He struck again and again, ultimately requiring 4 blows to complete the task. This was considered a terrible failure, bringing shame on the kaishakunin and distress to the dying man. In another case, recorded in detail by the British diplomat A.B. Mitford, who witnessed a seppuku ceremony in 1868, the kaishakunin struck perfectly on the first attempt, executing the daki-kubi technique flawlessly. Mitford's account praises the kaishakunin's skill, while also conveying his horror at the scene he had just witnessed. The most famous kaishakunin of the modern era was Hiroyasu Koga. In 1970, during the incident that came to be known as the Mishima incident, the celebrated novelist Yukio Mishima committed seppuku after a failed coup attempt. His chosen kaishakunin was Masakatsu Morita, a young follower. But Morita, though willing, was not skilled enough. He struck at Mishima's neck 3 times, hitting the shoulder on the first 2 attempts, causing terrible wounds but not death. Finally, Koga, who was present as one of the group, took the sword from Morita and completed the task with a single, clean strike. Morita then performed seppuku himself, and Koga served as his kaishakunin as well, this time succeeding on the first attempt. We'll return to this incident in more detail later. Beyond the physical technique, the kaishakunin had to manage his own emotions. He was about to kill a friend, a comrade, someone who trusted him with this final service. The psychological preparation required was significant. Historical sources mention kaishakunin spending time in meditation or prayer before performing their duty, steeling themselves for what was to come. After the strike, the kaishakunin's duties weren't quite finished. He would perform chiburi, the ritual shaking of blood from the blade, followed by noto, returning the sword to its scabbard. These movements had to be performed with the same control and formality as the strike itself. Everything about the kaishakunin's conduct contributed to the overall solemnity of the ritual. He might then kneel, showing respect to the body of the deceased, remaining in a state of heightened awareness called zanshin before finally standing and bowing. In some particularly formal ceremonies, there might be a second kaishakunin, or even a third, standing ready in case the primary assistant failed or was unable to complete his duty. This was practical contingency planning, but it also underscored the seriousness with which the role was taken. The relationship between the kaishakunin and the person performing seppuku could be profound. Historical accounts record instances of kaishakunin who, after performing their duty for a lord or close friend, then committed seppuku themselves. This was voluntary, not required, but it spoke to the depth of loyalty and grief. By following their friend or lord into death, they demonstrated that the bond extended beyond life. There was also a darker side to the kaishakunin role. In cases of forced seppuku, particularly where the condemned was considered dishonorable, the kaishakunin might be chosen specifically for his lack of connection to the dying man. The assignment became less an act of friendship and more an impersonal execution. The kaishakunin in these cases was essentially acting as executioner, though the ritual forms were still observed. Questions sometimes arose about what to do if the kaishakunin was suddenly unable to perform his duty. Perhaps he collapsed from the stress, or lost his nerve, or suffered a sudden illness. Proper planning usually meant having others present who could step in, as Koga did or Morita. But there are historical accounts of seppuku ceremonies that went awry when no skilled backup was available. One particularly tragic case involved an obligatory seppuku where the assigned kaishakunin, a relatively inexperienced young samurai, froze at the crucial moment. The man performing seppuku completed his cut and waited, but the blow never came. The gathering watched in horror as the kaishakunin stood paralyzed, unable to act. Finally, after what must have seemed an eternity, but was probably only seconds, an older samurai among the witnesses stepped forward, took the sword from the frozen kaishakunin's hands, and delivered the necessary strike. The original kaishakunin was disgraced, his failure becoming part of the historical record. The physical aftermath for the kaishakunin was considerable too. Despite the ritual cleanliness of using a drawn sword and the controlled nature of the ceremony, there was blood. A tremendous amount of blood. The kaishakunin's clothes would be spattered, his hands might be stained. After the ceremony, he would need to clean himself, change clothes, and likely spend time in ritual purification. Psychologically, the impact could be lasting. Some men served as kaishakunin multiple times over their lives, seemingly able to compartmentalize the experience and perform their duty without lasting trauma. Others found the experience haunting. There are accounts of kaishakunin who became withdrawn, who struggled with what they had done, even though they had performed their duty flawlessly and honorably. In the later Edo period, when fan seppuku became common, the role of kaishakunin actually became more prominent. Since the person committing seppuku was merely reaching toward a fan, the kaishakunin was really performing an execution rather than assisting in a suicide. The strike would come the instant the hand touched the fan, or even slightly before, so that death arrived before any cut could be made. This transformed the kaishakunin from assistant into primary actor, though the fiction of seppuku was maintained for the sake of honor. We should also note that the kaishakunin was always male. Women who committed ritual suicide, as we'll discuss in the next section, did so without assistance. The method they used, cutting the throat or major neck arteries, was designed to cause rapid death without requiring help. The kaishakunin role was thus bound up with masculine samurai culture, part of the homosocial world of warriors and their rituals. Today, the kaishakunin lives on primarily in the practice of martial arts, particularly Iaido, where the kata involving kaishaku are still taught and practiced. Students learn the proper stance, the correct angle of the cut, the control needed to stop the blade at just the right point. They're taught the philosophical and ethical dimensions as well, the respect for the person being assisted, the gravity of the responsibility, the importance of flawless execution. But these are performed with wooden swords, in dojo, as education and historical preservation. The actual practice of serving as kaishakunin ended decades ago, with the last documented case being Koga's assistance to Mishima and Morita in 1970. What remains is the memory of men who took on one of the most difficult duties imaginable: to end the life of a friend quickly and mercifully, to transform what could have been prolonged suffering into swift release, and to do so with such precision and control that the dignity of the ritual was preserved. The kaishakunin were the hidden heroes of seppuku, bearing a burden that brought no glory but whose importance cannot be overstated. Famous historical cases, medieval period to warring states. Now we turn to the individuals, the specific moments in history when seppuku was performed and its practice shaped events. These are not abstract principles or theoretical discussions. These are real people who faced impossible choices and made the decision to end their lives according to the rigid demands of their culture. Their stories illuminate the practice in ways that general descriptions cannot. We've already mentioned Minamoto no Yorimasa, who in 1180 committed what may be the first fully documented seppuku. But let's examine his case more closely. Yorimasa was not a young hothead seeking glory. He was in his 70s, a respected warrior and noted poet. When he chose this death at the Battle of Uji, he was making a statement about how a warrior should face defeat. The context matters. The Genpei War was just beginning, a conflict that would tear Japan apart for 5 years. Yorimasa had sided with Prince Mochihito against the powerful Taira clan. When Taira forces attacked, Yorimasa knew the battle was lost. He could have fled, perhaps found refuge somewhere, and lived out his remaining years in obscurity. Instead, he chose to die fighting, and when even that became impossible, to die on his own terms. His death poem, composed in the moments before he took his own life, became famous. Like a fossil tree from which we gather no flowers, sad has been my life, faded no fruit to produce. The image is poignant, a tree that has stood for so long, it has turned to stone, producing neither flowers nor fruit. Yet in choosing how to fall, Yorimasa transformed his death into something that would be remembered and celebrated for centuries. In that sense, his life did produce fruit, the model of how a samurai should die. Moving forward to the late 16th century, we encounter Shimizu Munaharu, whose seppuku in 1582 we briefly mentioned earlier. Let's examine this case in detail because it represents a crucial evolution in how seppuku was understood and practiced. Munaharu was the commander of Takamatsu Castle in what is now Okayama Prefecture. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then still rising to power as Hashiba Hideyoshi, laid siege to the castle, he employed a brilliantly effective and utterly ruthless tactic. He diverted a nearby river, flooding the entire area and turning the castle into an island. As the waters rose, Munaharu's situation became hopeless. His supplies were running out, his men were trapped, and there was no possibility of relief forces breaking through. Hideyoshi offered terms. If Munaharu would commit seppuku, everyone else in the castle would be spared. Their lives, their families, everything would be guaranteed. Munaharu could save hundreds of people by sacrificing himself. The choice, in a sense, wasn't really a choice at all. But that didn't make it any less significant. On the morning of June 4th, 1582, Munaharu prepared himself. He dressed in formal clothes, had himself placed in a small boat, and was rowed out onto the flooded waters. Both armies, Hideyoshi's besiegers and Munaharu's own garrison, could see him clearly. What followed was a public demonstration of samurai courage and honor. Munaharu knelt in the boat. He had no kaishakunin, not because he didn't want one, but because the circumstances made it impractical. This would be the old style, the painful way. He took his sword and plunged it into his abdomen, cutting from left to right. Then, showing extraordinary fortitude, he stabbed himself in the throat. He fell forward into the water, the boat rocking from his weight, blood spreading across the surface. He had saved his people and died in a manner that would be celebrated in song, play, and story for generations. Hideyoshi, despite being the architect of this situation, apparently respected Munaharu's courage. He ordered that Munaharu's family be treated well, that his garrison be allowed to disperse peacefully, and that his death be recorded with honor. This is important. Even enemies recognized the significance of a properly executed seppuku. It commanded respect across battle lines. Another significant case from this period involves one of Japan's most famous and controversial figures, Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was the first of the three great unifiers of Japan, the man who broke the power of the old Buddhist orders and began consolidating control over the warring provinces. He was brilliant, ruthless, and by 1582, close to achieving complete control of Japan. Then, betrayal. One of Nobunaga's generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. On the night of June 21st, 1582, Akechi's forces surrounded Nobunaga at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Nobunaga was essentially unarmed, with only a small bodyguard. He fought briefly, killing several attackers with a bow and then with a spear, but the situation was hopeless. Rather than be captured, Nobunaga withdrew to an inner room of the temple. What happened next is not entirely clear, as there were no surviving witnesses. But the accepted historical narrative is that Nobunaga committed seppuku, then ordered a servant to set fire to the temple to prevent his head from being taken as a trophy. The temple burned, destroying Nobunaga's body. His death was thus confirmed, only by reports from those who had been with him until the final moments, and by the fact that his body was never found. This case is significant because it shows seppuku as a final act of defiance. Nobunaga knew that Akechi would want his head as proof of victory and as a trophy. By destroying his own body, Nobunaga denied his enemy even that satisfaction. It was control extended beyond death, a final assertion of will. The irony is that Akechi gained nothing from his betrayal. Another of Nobunaga's generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the same man who had accepted Shimizu Munaharu's seppuku just weeks earlier, rushed back from his campaign, defeated Akechi at the Battle of Yamazaki, and continued Nobunaga's mission of unification. Akechi himself died in the aftermath. possibly also by Seppuku, though accounts vary. During the Warring States period, mass seppuku became increasingly common. When a castle fell and all hope was lost, groups of samurai would commit seppuku together rather than surrender. One of the most famous mass seppuku events occurred at Odawara Castle in 1590. The castle was the last major stronghold of the Hojo clan, one of the most powerful daimyo families in eastern Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, by now the de facto ruler of most of Japan, laid siege with an enormous force, reportedly over 200,000 men. The siege lasted 3 months. The Hojo had a strong position and considerable supplies, but eventually, the situation became untenable. Negotiators worked out terms. The castle would surrender peacefully, but the Hojo leadership would have to commit seppuku. Hojo Ujimasa, the retired head of the clan, and several of his key retainers performed seppuku, while his son Ujinao was sent into exile. With this act, the most powerful daimyo family in the Kanto region, which had ruled for 5 generations, came to an end. What's striking about many of these cases is the element of negotiation. Seppuku wasn't just imposed on the defeated, it was often part of a bargain, a way to end conflicts without complete annihilation of the losing side. The leaders would sacrifice themselves, preserving their honor and often the lives of their followers. The victors gained what they wanted: control of the territory or elimination of rivals, while also demonstrating mercy and respect for the courage of their enemies. But not all cases were noble or honored. Seppuku could also be punishment for crimes, and these instances were often harsher, with fewer courtesies extended. A samurai who committed murder, who stole, who violated serious taboos, might be ordered to commit seppuku as an alternative to common execution. Even here, though, it was considered a privilege. The alternative was to be executed like a criminal, decapitated by an official executioner, which was considered deeply shameful. One category of seppuku that became increasingly common, particularly in the early Edo period, was oibara, or tsuifuku, following one's lord in death. When a tsutomeis daimyo died, either of natural causes or by seppuku himself, his most loyal retainers might choose to commit seppuku as well, following their master into death. This practice, called junshi in some contexts, was seen as the ultimate demonstration of loyalty. However, it created practical problems. A powerful lord might have dozens or even hundreds of retainers. If all his most capable and loyal men killed themselves when he died, his heir would be left without experienced advisors and administrators. This could destabilize the entire domain. As a result, the Tokugawa shogunate eventually prohibited junshi, making it illegal for retainers to commit seppuku upon their lord's natural death. They could still do so if the lord was executed or died in battle, circumstances considered shameful, but not for normal death. This prohibition didn't entirely stop the practice. Some retainers defied the ban, committing seppuku anyway out of deep loyalty. But they did so knowing that their own families might face punishment. The shogunate was trying to rationalize the system, to bring order to what had been essentially voluntary traditions. Continuing the script with the 47 Ronin section and beyond. The 47 Ronin: loyalty, vengeance, and mass seppuku. Of all the stories of seppuku in Japanese history, none has captured the imagination more completely than the tale of the 47 Ronin. And here's the first thing you need to know. It's all true. Every dramatic element, the betrayal, the revenge, the mass suicide, actually happened. We have court records, eyewitness accounts, official documents, even the burial site, where you can visit their graves today. But here's the twist that most people miss. The whole thing might have been based on a misunderstanding. The incident that set off this entire chain of events, the attack that led to everything else, may have been triggered by something far pettier than the legends suggest. The traditional story, the one you'll find in plays and films, goes like this. A corrupt court official named Kira demanded bribes from two provincial lords, Asano and Kamei. Kamei paid. Asano refused. So Kira, bitter and insulted, began publicly humiliating Asano, day after day, until Asano finally snapped. Noble, principled Asano, driven to violence by an evil official's cruelty. But the actual historical records? They don't mention any of that. We have extensive documentation about the attack itself, about the trial, about everything that followed. And nowhere in the official accounts is there any mention of bribes, or systematic humiliation, or even Kira being particularly corrupt. That was all added 50 years later when the story was adapted for theater. What the records do tell us is this. On the morning of April 21st, 1701, in Edo Castle, Asano Naganori attacked Kira Yoshinaka with his short sword. He struck twice, wounding Kira on the forehead and shoulder. The injuries bled heavily, but weren't life-threatening. Officials immediately restrained Asano and separated the two men. Why did Asano attack? We don't actually know. The historical records are silent on his motivation. One contemporary account mentions Asano shouting something during the attack. Perhaps, "Do you remember my grudge from these past days?" But even that's not certain. It's entirely possible that whatever provocation existed was minor, even trivial. Perhaps just a personality conflict that escalated. Perhaps a series of small insults that Asano, young and proud, couldn't let go. But here's what we know for certain. The location of this attack changed everything. Drawing a weapon inside Edo Castle was one of the gravest offenses imaginable. The shogun's residence was supposed to be inviolate, a place of peace where conflicts were resolved through proper channels. The shogun, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, was furious. His carefully planned reception of imperial envoys had been disrupted by this violent outburst. By 4 p.m. that same day, less than 6 hours after the attack, Asano was ordered to commit seppuku. There would be no investigation into why he attacked, no consideration of provocation, no time to prepare properly or say farewells. By 6 p.m., Asano was dead. But the punishment didn't stop there. The shogunate confiscated his domain, abolished his house, and declared all his retainers to be Ronin, masterless samurai with no lord, no position, no purpose. In feudal Japan, this was devastating. A samurai's entire identity came from service to a lord. Without that, he was nothing. News reached Akko domain 5 days later. Oishi Kuranosuke, Asano's chief retainer and the highest ranking of his samurai, found himself in an impossible bind. His lord was dead, executed for a crime that may or may not have been justified. His domain was being confiscated by the shogunate. His 300-plus fellow samurai were about to lose everything. Some wanted to fight, to die defending their castle. Others argued for immediate mass seppuku at the castle gates, dying together to show their grief. But Oishi convinced them to wait. He surrendered the castle peacefully on May 26th, buying time to consider their options. And here's where the story takes its dramatic turn. Oishi had a plan, but he couldn't share it with everyone. He knew that revenge, killing Kira to avenge Asano, would be considered murder. It was explicitly illegal. The shogunate had ruled that Kira bore no responsibility for the incident. Going after him would mean death for everyone involved. So Oishi took a gamble. He moved to Kyoto and started living a deliberately dissolute life. He frequented brothels, drank heavily, gambled, acted like a man who had given up completely. He even divorced his wife, ostensibly so she wouldn't be implicated in what was to come, but also as part of the performance. Word spread. The great Oishi Kuranosuke had become a pathetic drunk. Kira's spies reported all of this. They watched Oishi stumble through pleasure quarters, passed out in gutters, apparently broken by the loss of his lord. And slowly, Kira relaxed his security. If even Oishi had given up, surely there was no real threat. This was exactly what Oishi wanted. In secret, he had gathered 47 men, not all of Asano's retainers, but the ones willing to commit to a suicide mission. Because that's what it was. They all knew that killing Kira would mean their own deaths. There was no escape, no survival scenario. The plan was revenge, then seppuku. They spent nearly 2 years preparing, gathering weapons, training, planning every detail, waiting for Kira to become complacent enough that they could actually reach him. December 14th, 1702. Snow falling. Perfect conditions for a night raid. The 47 Ronins struck Kira's mansion from 2 directions simultaneously. They wore matching outfits for identification, carried drums to coordinate movements, and had strict orders. Find Kira, kill him, harm no one else unless they actively resisted. The attack was brilliantly executed. They found Kira hiding in a storage building, still in his nightclothes, terrified. Oishi identified him by the scars on his forehead and shoulder, the wounds from Asano's attack nearly 2 years earlier. They gave Kira a chance to die honorably. They offered him the same dagger Asano had used for his seppuku, inviting him to use it himself. Kira refused. He begged for his life. So Oishi, as the senior man, killed him. His head was severed. Now here's the part that demonstrates the depth of their commitment to proper form, even in murder. They took Kira's head to a well, washed it carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it through the streets of Edo to Sengakuji Temple. There, they placed it on Asano's grave as an offering to their dead lord. Then they turned themselves in. The shogunate faced a dilemma. Legally, these men had committed murder. They'd killed a shogunate official. By all rights, they should be executed as criminals, their bodies thrown away, their families punished. But public opinion exploded in their favor. People celebrated them as heroes. They'd done what Bushido demanded. They'd avenged their lord. After months of debate, a compromise was reached. On February 4th, 1703, the Ronin were divided into 4 groups and sent to the mansions of 4 different daimyo. There, all 46 of the remaining men, one had been sent away earlier to report to Akko, committed seppuku with full honors, not as criminals, but as samurai. They were buried at Sengakuji Temple next to Lord Asano, where their graves remain today. And their story became immortal, adapted into plays within decades, told and retold for over 3 centuries as the ultimate example of samurai loyalty. But here's the final twist. Some modern historians argue that Oishi and his companions may have actually hoped for a different outcome. Perhaps they thought their act of vengeance would be pardoned. Perhaps they believed public opinion would protect them. The death poems they composed suggest genuine acceptance of their fate, but we can't know for certain what they truly expected. What we do know is this. Their mass seppuku transformed a technically illegal act of murder into something celebrated as the highest expression of Bushido values. Their deaths made them heroes, and ironically, by dying, they achieved the immortality that living would have denied them. The story of the 47 Ronin became immediately famous, and has remained so for over 3 centuries. Within decades, it was adapted into kabuki theater, bunraku puppet plays, and other dramatic forms. The most famous adaptation is the play Kanadahon Chushingura, first performed in 1748, which has been restaged countless times and adapted into numerous films. What makes this story so enduring? Several factors. First, it's a true story, which gives it power that pure fiction cannot match. These were real people who made real choices, who lived and died by the principles that they claim to uphold. Second, it perfectly embodies the ideals of Bushido: loyalty, courage, patience, careful planning, willingness to sacrifice. Third, It has dramatic elements that make it compelling. The provocation, the planning, the surprise attack, the resolution. But there's something else, something deeper. The story of the 47 Ronin is fundamentally about the conflict between duty and law, between personal honor and social order. The Ronin did what Bushido told them they should do, but in doing so, they broke the law. The shogunate, by ordering them to commit seppuku, upheld the law while also acknowledging the validity of their motives. It's a story about impossible choices and the price of honor. Their graves at Sengakuji Temple became, and remain, a site of pilgrimage. People come to pay respects, to burn incense, to remember these men who lived and died for principles they held more important than life itself. Every year on December 14th, the anniversary of their attack on Kira, a festival commemorates the event. The 47 Ronin are celebrated as exemplars of samurai virtue, their story retold to new generations. There's even a well at Sengakuji, traditionally identified as the place where the Ronin washed Kira's head before presenting it to Asano's grave. It's still there, still visited by those who want to connect with this history. The story raises profound questions that remain relevant. When does loyalty require breaking the law? When is revenge justice? How do we balance individual honor against social stability? These aren't abstract philosophical debates. For the 47 Ronin, they were matters of life and death, questions they answered with their actions and ultimately with their lives. In the context of understanding seppuku, the story of the 47 Ronin is invaluable. It shows us seppuku as both voluntary and obligatory, as punishment and privilege, as ending and legacy. These men chose their path, knowing it would lead to seppuku. They embraced that fate as the price of their revenge and the seal on their loyalty. Their mass seppuku transformed their act of murder into something honored, their deaths into examples for others to follow. And perhaps most significantly, it demonstrates that seppuku was never just about dying. It was about how one died, why one died, and what one's death meant. The 47 Ronin didn't just die. They died in a way that told a story, that proved something, that became legend. In that sense, their seppuku wasn't an ending at all. It was immortality. Social and legal aspects, when and why it was performed. To fully understand seppuku, we must examine it not just as individual acts, but as a social institution. By the Edo period, seppuku had become codified, formalized, and integrated into the legal system of Tokugawa Japan. It served multiple purposes: as punishment, as political tool, as social practice, and as cultural symbol. Let's start with the basic distinction between voluntary and obligatory seppuku. Voluntary seppuku was, as the name suggests, chosen by the samurai himself. A warrior who had failed his lord, brought shame to his family, or found himself in an impossible situation might decide that seppuku was the only way to restore honor. He would make the decision independently, though he might consult with family or close advisors. He would arrange the details, choose his kaishakunin, prepare his death poem, and carry out the act. Obligatory seppuku, by contrast, was ordered by a superior authority. This might be a daimyo ordering one of his retainers to commit seppuku, or more commonly, the shogunate ordering a daimyo or high-ranking samurai to do so. This form of seppuku was essentially capital punishment, but with a crucial difference. It was reserved exclusively for the samurai class. Common criminals, regardless of their crime, could not commit seppuku. They would be executed by other means, typically decapitation, by an official executioner. This distinction was important. Seppuku, even when ordered as punishment, carried with it an element of honor. It demonstrated that despite whatever crime or failure had occurred, the condemned person was still samurai, still worthy of dying in the traditional warrior manner. It spared him and his family the greater shame of common execution. What crimes might lead to obligatory seppuku? During the Edo period, the list was surprisingly broad. Murder was an obvious one, as was theft or corruption. But violations of protocol could also merit this punishment. Drawing a weapon in anger, particularly in certain locations like Edo Castle, or on the grounds of a lord's residence, was grounds for obligatory seppuku. Even relatively minor offenses, if they were seen as violations of samurai codes or brought public dishonor, could result in this sentence. The case of Asano Naganori, which we discussed in detail in the previous section, illustrates this. His crime, attacking another official inside Edo Castle, was certainly serious. But Kira wasn't killed, wasn't even severely injured. In another context, this might have been punished with demotion, fine, or temporary house arrest. But because it occurred in Edo Castle, because it disrupted important state ceremonies, because it violated such fundamental protocol, the sentence was immediate seppuku. The punishment wasn't always individual. In some cases, entire groups might be ordered to commit seppuku. When a daimyo was convicted of a serious offense and his domain was confiscated, some or all of his senior retainers might be ordered to follow him into death. This served multiple purposes. It eliminated the leadership of the disbanded domain. It prevented potential resistance or revenge plots, and it demonstrated the absolute power of the shogunate. There was also the practice we mentioned earlier, oibara, or tsuifuku, following one's lord into death. This was technically voluntary, but social pressure could make it feel obligatory. When a great lord died, particularly if he died in battle or was forced to commit seppuku himself, his most loyal retainers might be expected to follow him. Not to do so could be seen as disloyalty or cowardice. The shogunate's prohibition of junshi, following one's lord who died of natural causes, in the mid-1600s was an attempt to stop this practice from destabilizing domains and wasting the lives of capable administrators. But the prohibition wasn't universally obeyed. Some retainers defied it, committing seppuku despite the law. These men knew they were breaking the law, knew their families might face consequences, but chose loyalty over legality. Another form of seppuku with political implications was kanshi, suicide as protest. This was rare, but it happened. A samurai who believed his lord or the shogunate had made a grievous error might commit seppuku as a form of public criticism. The death itself was the message, a dramatic statement that could not be ignored. One famous case of kanshi involved the tutor of Oda Nobunaga. The young Nobunaga was wild, undisciplined, and seemed to be wasting his potential. His tutor, Hirate Masahide, tried repeatedly to instruct and guide him, but Nobunaga ignored all advice. Finally, in 1553, Masahide committed seppuku, leaving a note that essentially said, "My death may teach you what my life could not." The act shocked Nobunaga profoundly. Historical accounts suggest it was a turning point in his life, leading him to take his responsibilities more seriously. Kanshi was risky. If authorities deemed it illegitimate protest, or saw it as an attempt to manipulate through emotional blackmail, the protester's family might face punishment. But if the act was seen as sincere and the grievance legitimate, it could be powerful. The willingness to die for one's principles commanded respect, even from those who disagreed with the specifics. The formalization of seppuku as legal punishment during the Edo period involved careful regulation. Protocols were established for how the ritual should be conducted, who should be present, how the body should be handled afterward, what records should be kept. These protocols varied somewhat depending on the rank of the condemned and the severity of the offense, but they followed general patterns. For a high-ranking samurai ordered to commit seppuku, the ritual might be quite elaborate. He would be given time to put his affairs in order, to arrange his finances, to say farewell to family. He would be allowed to choose his own kaishakunin if possible. He would compose his death poem. On the appointed day, he would be taken to an appropriate location. often the residence of the official overseeing the execution. The ceremony would be conducted with proper formality. Witnesses present to confirm that the sentence had been carried out correctly. For a lower-ranking samurai, or one whose crime was considered particularly shameful, courtesies might be reduced. Less time to prepare, a stranger assigned as kaishakunin, fewer witnesses, a less prestigious location. The basic structure remained the same, but the details conveyed the degree of honor or dishonor attached to the death. Seppuku, which became common in the late Edo period, was a response to practical realities. As we discussed earlier, actual disembowelment was extraordinarily difficult and painful. Many samurai, particularly those who had lived their entire lives in peace, had never experienced serious physical trauma. Asking them to cut open their own bellies was asking for something beyond most people's capacity. Seppuku solved this problem while maintaining the symbolism. The condemned would reach for the fan, representing his willingness to perform the act. The kaishakunin would strike immediately, ending the life before pain could compromise composure. It was a fiction, yes, but a useful one. The samurai died with honor. The authorities could record that seppuku had been performed, and everyone could avoid the messy, unreliable reality of actual disembowelment. Some traditionalists criticize this evolution, seeing it as a softening of samurai values, a decline from the harsh realities their ancestors had faced. But pragmatists understood that the symbolism mattered more than the specifics. What was being demonstrated through seppuku? Courage, acceptance of responsibility, adherence to proper forms. These things could be demonstrated through seppuku just as well as through the more painful traditional method. The social class aspect of seppuku cannot be overstated. This was a privilege and burden of the samurai class alone. Merchants couldn't commit seppuku, no matter how wealthy or influential. Farmers couldn't, nor could artisans. Only samurai. And the distinction was absolute. This created some interesting situations in the complex social hierarchy of Edo Japan. Some individuals occupied ambiguous positions or moved between classes. What happened if a samurai was stripped of his status for some offense, reduced to commoner status? He could no longer commit seppuku. If executed, it would be as a common criminal. Conversely, what about the rare cases of commoners who were elevated to samurai status for exceptional service? They gained the right to commit seppuku, a right they might never use, but that marked their transformation in social identity. The exclusivity of seppuku reinforced samurai identity and privilege. It was one of the markers that separated samurai from everyone else. And because seppuku was seen as an honorable death, exclusive access to it implied that samurais were, in fundamental ways, different from and superior to commoners. This wasn't just about legal status or occupation. It was about moral character, courage, adherence to principles. Or at least, that was the theory. In practice, of course, samurai were human, with all the variability that implies. Not all samurai were courageous. Not all adhered to bushido principles. And in peaceful Edo Japan, where actual combat was rare, many samurai were essentially bureaucrats with swords, paper pushers who happened to be descended from warriors. The reality didn't always match the ideology, but the ideology mattered. The belief that samurai should be willing to commit seppuku, that they should hold honor above life, that they should die with proper composure and dignity. This belief shaped behavior and social expectations. Even samurai, who never came close to actually committing seppuku, lived with the knowledge that this was how they should be prepared to die. Seppuku also functioned as a form of social control. The threat of being ordered to commit seppuku was a powerful deterrent against disobedience or misconduct. A samurai who contemplated rebellion or serious crime had to consider not just his own death, but the manner of it. Common execution was shameful, disgraceful, affecting one's entire family line. Seppuku, while still death, at least preserved some honor. This distinction gave authorities leverage. Cooperate, accept your punishment, and you can die as a samurai should. Resist, and you'll be executed like a criminal. The practice also served to resolve disputes and end conflicts without prolonged violence. When negotiations broke down between two powerful figures, one option was for the weaker party to be ordered to commit seppuku. This eliminated the threat they posed while avoiding the messiness of battle, the potential for civilian casualties, the destabilization that comes with prolonged conflict. It was, in a sense, a highly ritualized form of political assassination, one that maintained surfaces of legality and honor. By the late Edo period, seppuku had become so integrated into the legal and social system that its original meanings were arguably diluted. It was less about voluntary acts of honor and more about bureaucratic procedure. Fill out the right forms, conduct the ceremony according to protocol, record the event in official documents. The spiritual and emotional dimensions, while still present, competed with administrative requirements. Some historians argue that this formalization actually preserved seppuku in a form that made sense for a peaceful, orderly society. The wild, desperate seppuku of the medieval battlefield didn't fit Edo society. But formalized, regulated, predictable seppuku could serve useful functions. As punishment, as conflict resolution, as maintenance of social hierarchy and identity. Others argue that this formalization marked seppuku's transformation from a meaningful act into empty ritual, that something essential was lost when the practice became routine and safe. When every detail was prescribed, when the most dangerous element, actual disembowelment, was often eliminated, what remained? A ceremony, a gesture, a symbol. Still meaningful perhaps, but not in the same visceral, immediate way as when a warrior on a battlefield chose to open his own belly rather than be captured. Both perspectives have merit. What's clear is that by the time the Meiji Restoration began in 1868, seppuku as a regular practice was already something of an anachronism. It persisted because of tradition, because of legal precedent, because of the weight of centuries. But its days were numbered. Women and ritual suicide, a separate tradition. Until now, we've focused almost exclusively on male samurai and their practice of seppuku. But women of the samurai class also face situations where honor seemed to demand death. However, their practice differed significantly from male seppuku, in both method and meaning. Understanding these differences tells us much about gender, honor, and the different roles men and women played in samurai culture. First, we must address a common misconception. In many Western sources, particularly older books and martial arts publications, you'll find references to jigai as the female equivalent of seppuku. This is not accurate. The word jigai means simply suicide in general. It's not gender specific, and it's not a technical term for any particular method. This confusion stems largely from a misunderstanding by Lafcadio Hearn, the 19th century writer who introduced many aspects of Japanese culture to English-speaking audiences. Hearn mistakenly identified jigai as the female counterpart to seppuku, and this error has been perpetuated in numerous texts since. So, if not jigai, what did we call it? There wasn't actually a specific term equivalent to seppuku. Women's ritual suicide was simply that, suicide, but performed in a particular way and for particular reasons. The method was different from male seppuku. Women did not disembowel themselves. Instead, they used a sharp blade, typically a tanto or a kaikin, a smaller knife often carried by women of the samurai class, to cut their own throats. Specifically, they would cut the jugular vein and carotid artery on one side of the neck with a single deep stroke. This caused rapid blood loss and relatively quick death, usually within minutes. Why this method instead of abdominal cutting? Several reasons. First, it was more immediately fatal. Unlike abdominal wounds, which could take hours to cause death, severing the major blood vessels in the neck brought unconsciousness within seconds and death shortly thereafter. This meant women could perform the act without assistance, without needing a kaishakunin to end their suffering. Second, it required less physical strength. Cutting through the abdominal wall and into the viscera required considerable force. The throat was more accessible, the vessels closer to the surface. A woman could perform this act with greater certainty of success. Third, and this is speculation on the part of historians, there may have been cultural considerations around the symbolism of the abdomen. For men, opening the belly had specific meaning related to revealing one's inner self, proving one's sincerity. These associations may have been tied to masculine concepts of honor and self. For women, different symbolism applied. Before performing this act, women would take a specific precaution that speaks volumes about cultural attitudes toward female dignity. They would bind their knees together or secure their lower body in a way that ensured they would be found in a proper, modest position. This might involve sitting with their backs against a post or tying their legs at the knees and ankles. This may seem like a small detail, but it was enormously important to the women who did it. Even in death, even in the convulsions that might follow cutting one's own throat, modesty must be preserved. The body might spasm, might fall, but the bound legs ensured it would not sprawl in a way considered undignified for a woman. Even in choosing death, women were constrained by and attentive to gendered expectations about proper behavior and appearance. When did women of the samurai class perform this act? The most common scenario was when their husbands had been killed or had committed seppuku themselves. If a castle was falling and defeat was imminent, if enemies were breaking through the defenses, women might choose death rather than risk capture, rape, or enslavement. In these situations, we see mass female suicides alongside the mass male seppuku we discussed earlier. One of the most documented mass female suicides occurred at the end of the Boshin War in 1868 to 1869. The Aizu clan had remained loyal to the shogunate during the Meiji Restoration and found itself besieged at their castle. As the castle's fall became inevitable, large numbers of samurai women chose ritual suicide. In the extended family of Seigo Tonomo alone, 22 women died by their own hands. They gathered together, said their farewells, bound their legs, and cut their throats in sequence. The youngest was reportedly 16 years old. These weren't isolated acts of panic or despair. They were deliberate choices made in accordance with understood codes of honor. For these women, capture by the victorious imperial forces was unacceptable. Whether from fear of what might happen to them, or from commitment to the principle of dying with honor rather than living in shame, they chose death. Another scenario involved following one's husband into death, similar to the male practice of oibara. When a samurai husband committed seppuku, particularly if it was for reasons of honor rather than as punishment for crimes, his wife might choose to die as well. This demonstrated her loyalty to her husband and to her family's honor. One famous case involves Onodera Tan, the wife of Onodera Junai, one of the 47 Ronin. After her husband and the other Ronin committed seppuku following their revenge on Kira, Onodera Tan chose to die as well, though the method is disputed. Some sources say she starved herself to death over a period of weeks, a slow suicide that demonstrated her grief and loyalty. Others suggest she may have used the more common method of cutting her throat. Either way, her death was voluntary and understood as an act of honor and devotion. Women's ritual suicide lacked some of the elements that characterized male seppuku. There were no kaishakunin, as we've noted, since the method was designed to cause quick death without assistance. There was typically no formal ceremony with witnesses and officials. and generally, there was less documentation. Men's seppuku, particularly obligatory seppuku, was often a matter of official record, with dates, locations, names of witnesses, all carefully documented. Women's deaths were more private, less likely to be formally recorded, remembered primarily within families and local communities. This creates challenges for historians trying to understand the full extent of the practice. We have clear documentation for notable cases, like the mass suicides at Aizu. We have family histories and temple records that mention specific women. But how common was it? How many women over the centuries chose this death? The numbers are impossible to determine with certainty. What we can say is that the practice was real, known, and accepted within samurai culture. Women of the samurai class were trained from childhood in the possibility of this fate. They learned the method, learned when it might be appropriate, learned how to bind their legs properly. Mothers taught daughters, passing on this knowledge as part of preparing them for the realities of samurai life. The weapons used deserve mention. Many samurai women carried a kaikin, a small dagger, as part of their daily dress. This wasn't primarily a weapon for combat. Women weren't expected to fight. It was specifically for this purpose, a means of preserving honor through suicide if circumstances demanded it. The kaikin might be plain and purely functional, or it might be ornate, a piece of jewelry that also served this darker function. Either way, its presence was a constant reminder of the possibility of ritual suicide. There's a Zen-like paradox here. These women carried the means of their own death with them always, yet most would never use it. The kaikin was both insurance and burden, both protection and threat. To carry it meant accepting the possibility of using it, living with that awareness daily. In literature and drama, women's ritual suicide became a powerful symbol. The image of a samurai woman, composed and resolute, binding her legs and taking her own life to preserve honor or demonstrate loyalty, appears in countless works. Often these scenes emphasize the contrast between physical delicacy and inner strength, between culturally prescribed femininity and the harsh action being taken. But we must be careful about romanticization. These were traumatic events. Women who made this choice were facing circumstances of extreme stress, often with limited information and even more limited options. The cultural framework that made ritual suicide seem not just acceptable, but honorable to them, was created by and served a social system that limited women's agency and choices in fundamental ways. Consider the situation of a woman whose castle is under siege. Her husband has died in battle or committed seppuku. Enemy forces are breaking through. She has young children with her. The cultural expectation is that she should kill herself to avoid capture. But that means abandoning her children. What kind of choice is that? Historical accounts sometimes mention women who survived these situations, either because they chose not to perform ritual suicide, or because their attempts failed. These women were sometimes criticized for lacking courage or loyalty. The social pressure to die, in other words, was real and could be intense. Yet there were also voices, even in the feudal period, questioning whether such deaths were necessary or admirable. Some Buddhist teachers argued that suicide, regardless of circumstances, violated Buddhist precepts. Some Confucian scholars suggested that a woman's duty to her children might outweigh other considerations. And some survivors of battles and sieges went on to rebuild their lives and families, suggesting that choosing life over death was a viable option, even if not the culturally celebrated one. By the Meiji period, as Japan modernized and Western influences increased, attitudes toward women's ritual suicide began to shift. The practice was seen increasingly as barbaric, a relic of a more brutal age. The new government didn't explicitly outlaw it, any more than male seppuku was outlawed initially, but it fell out of favor rapidly. The last well-documented mass female suicide of this type was probably the Aizu case from 1868 to 1869. After that, While individual instances may have occurred, they became increasingly rare and were not publicly celebrated or memorialized in the way they had been previously. In understanding seppuku and samurai culture more, broadly, women's ritual suicide presents us with complicated questions. It demonstrates that the ideals of honor, loyalty, and choosing death over shame were not exclusively male. Women shared these values and were prepared to die for them. At the same time, the different methods and circumstances reflect real differences in how men and women were positioned within samurai society, what was expected of them, and what options they had. These women made real choices within constrained circumstances based on values they genuinely held. We can recognize their courage, their strength of will, their commitment to principles, while also questioning the system that made such choices seem necessary. That's the nuance required when examining any historical practice that seems so alien to modern sensibilities. Decline and modern cases. The end of an era. The Meiji Restoration that began in 1868 transformed Japan so completely that it's hard to overstate the magnitude of change. In just a few decades, Japan went from a feudal society governed by samurai and shoguns to a modern nation-state with a constitutional government, industrialized economy, and westernized military. The samurai class, which had dominated Japanese society for centuries, was abolished, and with it, eventually, went the practice of seppuku. The transformation wasn't immediate. In 1868, seppuku was still an accepted practice, still regularly performed in certain circumstances. By 1900, it had become rare, viewed increasingly as a relic of a bygone era. What happened in those 3 decades? First, the legal system changed. The new Meiji government, modeling itself on Western nations, established new legal codes. Capital punishment was still practiced, but it followed Western forms, hanging as the primary method. The idea that certain criminals should be allowed to commit ritual suicide instead of being executed seemed increasingly out of place in a modern legal system. In 1873, the Meiji government formally abolished seppuku as a form of official punishment. This didn't make seppuku itself illegal. You couldn't be prosecuted just for committing suicide. But it removed seppuku's formal legal status. It was no longer an official alternative to other forms of execution. If a person was sentenced to death, they would hang, regardless of their social class or preference. This change was part of a broader effort to dismantle the privileges of the samurai class. In 1869, the hereditary social class system was reformed. In 1871, samurai lost their exclusive right to be government officials. In 1873, the government established universal conscription, creating a national army that didn't depend on samurai warriors. In 1876, samurai were even forbidden from wearing their swords in public, stripping them of one of their most visible symbols. These reforms faced resistance. Some samurai rebelled, unwilling to accept the new order. The most famous and serious of these rebellions was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, who had become disillusioned with its direction. The rebellion was crushed by the new conscript army, demonstrating decisively that the age of samurai military dominance was over. Saigo himself died during the final battle, and while accounts vary, he likely committed seppuku or was given a mercy strike by a loyal follower as he lay dying from a bullet wound. Even after the formal abolition of seppuku as legal punishment, some individuals continued to practice it voluntarily. These cases became increasingly notable precisely because they were increasingly rare. One of the most famous post-abolition cases occurred in 1912. General Nogi Maresuke was a celebrated military hero, a veteran of Japan's victories in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. He was revered as the embodiment of samurai values in the modern age. When Emperor Meiji died on July 30th, 1912, Nogi was deeply affected. The emperor had been not just his sovereign, but his inspiration, and, in some sense, his lord in the traditional samurai understanding. On September 13, 1912, the day of Emperor Meiji's funeral, Nogi and his wife committed suicide together. Nogi performed traditional seppuku, cutting his abdomen in the formal manner, then cutting his throat. His wife, Shizuko, cut her own throat in the traditional female manner. They left notes explaining their decision. They were following their emperor into death, demonstrating loyalty even beyond the grave. The reaction was complex. Many Japanese, particularly older generations and those nostalgic for traditional values, praised Nogi's action as the ultimate demonstration of loyalty and honor. He had lived according to samurai principles and died according to them. Others, particularly younger Japanese and those focused on modernization, were horrified. This was 1912, not 1612. Japan was a modern nation now. Such acts seemed archaic, even barbaric. The incident sparked intense debate about tradition, modernity, and Japanese identity. Was Nogi a hero, the last true samurai, whose death should be honored and remembered? Or was he a tragic figure, trapped by outdated ideologies, whose death accomplished nothing and left his country poorer? These debates continue even today, over a century later. The question of yunshi, following one's lord into death, was particularly contentious. The practice had been officially prohibited in the Edo-period, then became irrelevant with the abolition of the feudal system. Nogi's act revived it, suggesting that perhaps these traditions weren't as dead as many had thought. Some worried that his example might inspire others, leading to a wave of ritual suicides. This didn't happen, but the fear was real. During the military expansion and World War II period, elements of bushido and samurai culture were revived and weaponized by the Japanese military and government. Young soldiers were taught to value honor over life, to see death in service of the emperor as the highest achievement. Surrender was considered shameful, worse than death. This ideology contributed to behaviors like kamikaze attacks and the refusal of many Japanese soldiers to surrender even in hopeless situations. Did this represent a revival of seppuku? Not exactly. While the underlying principles of preferring death to dishonor were similar, the actual practice of seppuku was uncommon. Soldiers who couldn't face surrender might charge into enemy fire or blow themselves up with grenades, but formal ritual disembowelment was rare. The ideology lived on, but the specific practice had faded. After Japan's defeat in 1945, there were numerous suicides among military and civilian leaders. Some used pistols, some used poison, some used traditional methods. A few performed seppuku. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, known as the father of the kamikaze special attack units, committed seppuku on August 16, 1945, the day after Japan's surrender. He left a note apologizing for leading so many young men to their deaths. His seppuku was performed in the traditional manner, though he refused any kaishakunin, choosing instead to endure the pain for 15 hours before finally dying of blood loss. But these post-war cases were seen as the death throes of a discredited ideology. Japan, under American occupation and Reconstruction, moved decisively away from militaristic bushido and toward democratic, pacifist values. Seppuku became something studied as history, not practiced as contemporary culture. The most famous seppuku of the modern era, and almost certainly the last one performed with full traditional intent, occurred on November 25, 1970. We opened tonight's story with this incident, and now we return to it with full context. Yukio Mishima was 45 years old at the height of his creative powers, nominated 5 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. His novels, including The Temple of the Golden Pavilion and The Sea of Fertility tetralogy, had established him as one of Japan's greatest writers. But Mishima was also increasingly troubled by what he saw as Japan's cultural surrender after World War II. Post-war Japan had embraced democracy, pacifism, and economic growth. The emperor had been reduced from a semi-divine figure to a constitutional symbol. Article 9 of the new constitution prohibited Japan from maintaining offensive military forces. To Mishima, this represented a castration of Japanese identity, a betrayal of everything that had made Japan great. In 1968, he formed the Tatenokai, the Shield Society, a private militia of about 100 university students. On the surface, it was legal, even quaint. They wore uniforms, trained with wooden swords, pledged to protect the emperor. But Mishima's vision was more radical. He wanted to restore the emperor to real power, to resurrect the spiritual values of pre-war Japan, to make bushido relevant again. On the morning of November 25, 1970, Mishima completed the final manuscript of his Sea of Fertility tetralogy. He placed it on his desk with a note. "Human life is limited, but I would like to live forever." Then he and 4 Tatenokai members drove to the headquarters of Japan's self-defense forces in Ichigaya, Tokyo. They requested a meeting with General Kanetoshi Mishita, ostensibly to show him an antique sword from Mishima's collection. Once in the general's office, they took him hostage, barricading the door. Mishima went out onto a balcony and tried to address about 1,000 servicemen who had gathered below. He called for a coup. He urged them to rise up, overthrow the constitution, restore the emperor's power, make Japan strong again. The soldiers jeered. They laughed at him. Some shouted insults. After about 10 minutes of trying to be heard over the mockery, Mishima gave up and went back inside. And here's where we return to our opening scene. Mishima knelt in the traditional position. His chosen kaishakunin was Masakatsu Morita, 25 years old, devoted to Mishima, possibly his lover. The other members of their group acted as witnesses. Mishima opened his kimono, took his tanto, and cut across his abdomen from left to right. He had the fortitude to complete the cut. By all accounts, he did it correctly, deep enough, controlled enough. Approximately 50 centimeters of his small intestine were exposed, according to the autopsy report. Now, Morita's task was simple. Step forward and deliver a single, clean strike to the neck, partially severing it to bring instant death while leaving a small strip of skin at the front so the head would fall forward properly. It was the culmination of centuries of refinement, a technique preserved in martial arts kata and practiced by students of Aikido. One stroke. That's all it should take. Morita struck. He missed, hitting Mishima's shoulder. Blood sprayed, but Mishima was still conscious, still alive. Now, with a deep shoulder wound on top of his opened abdomen, Morita struck again. Another miss. Again, hitting the shoulder. You can imagine Mishima's agony. Disemboweled, now being hacked at by a kaishakunin who couldn't complete his task. Hiroyasu Koga, another member of the group and an experienced kendo practitioner, finally stepped forward. He took the sword from Morita and delivered a proper strike. Clean, precise. Mishima's suffering ended. Then Morita, traumatized by his failure, still committed to the plan, stabbed himself in the abdomen. But he couldn't cut deeply enough, either from lack of skill or because he was shaking too badly. He signaled Koga. This time, Koga succeeded on the first attempt. The 3 surviving members were arrested. Mishima and Morita's bodies were carried out. And within hours, the world knew. An international literary celebrity had just committed ritual suicide after a failed coup attempt, broadcast live on television. Japan's anachronistic ritual had collided with modern media in the most shocking way possible. The reaction in Japan was overwhelmingly negative. Most people saw Mishima's act not as noble sacrifice, but as grotesque theater. The actions of a man who'd confused his own novels with reality. His political message was rejected. His coup had been a farce. His speech mocked by the very soldiers he'd tried to inspire. And yet, in the decades since, there's been a gradual reassessment. Mishima's literary reputation has only grown. His death is increasingly viewed not as simple madness, but as his final artistic statement, a performance that was horrifying and genuine at once. Museums preserve his legacy. His books sell worldwide. The Mishima incident has become the most famous seppuku since the 47 Ronin. But here's what's most significant for our story. Mishima's death marked the absolute end of seppuku as a living practice. There have been no documented cases of formal traditional seppuku since 1970. Individual suicides using blades still occur, but they lack the ritual context, the witnesses, the kaishakunin, the cultural framework that made something seppuku rather than just suicide. The kaishakunin's failure, Morita striking 3 times and missing, seems almost symbolic. After centuries of refinement, after generations of practice, after countless performances of this ritual, even in 1970, it could still go catastrophically wrong. The technique that was supposed to transform brutal death into aesthetic ritual, to make horror into honor, revealed its fundamental nature. It was still just one person cutting another person's neck while that person bled from a self-inflicted abdominal wound. Mishima wanted to prove that bushido still mattered, that the old ways could be revived. Instead, his death demonstrated why they'd been abandoned. The modern world had no place for ritual disembowelment, no matter how perfectly executed. And as Morita's trembling strikes proved, even true believers couldn't reliably perform what tradition demanded. In contemporary Japan, seppuku is history, studied in schools, depicted in films and television, remembered as part of the cultural past. Public attitudes are mixed. There's respect for the historical samurai, who lived according to their codes, appreciation for the courage required to face death in that manner. But there's also relief that this particular practice has ended, that modern Japanese society doesn't demand such sacrifices. Some conservative nationalists still celebrate seppuku as an example of traditional Japanese virtues, of selflessness and discipline supposedly lacking in contemporary society. But they represent a minority view. Most Japanese see seppuku as they see other historical practices like the caste system or arranged marriages, part of the past, informative about history and culture, but not something to revive. The practice does live on in cultural forms. Seppuku appears frequently in historical dramas, anime, manga, and films. It's a dramatic plot device, a way to demonstrate a character's commitment or resolve. The historical cases, particularly the 47 Ronin, continue to be retold and reinterpreted for new generations. And in traditional martial arts like Edo, the kata involving seppuku and kaishaku are still practiced, keeping the technical knowledge alive, even if the application is purely historical. Interestingly, the language of seppuku persists in modern Japanese discourse, albeit metaphorically. Someone who takes responsibility for a failure, particularly a public figure who resigns from office after a scandal, might be described as committing social seppuku or political seppuku. The phrase refers to the act of accepting responsibility and stepping down rather than clinging to power. It's seppuku stripped of its literal meaning, but retaining its connotations of honor, responsibility, and self-sacrifice. The end of seppuku as a living practice raises questions about cultural continuity and change. Is modern Japan less Japanese for having abandoned this tradition? Or is it more authentically itself for having evolved beyond practices rooted in a particular historical moment? These aren't easy questions, and Japanese people themselves don't agree on the answers. What seems clear is that seppuku served specific purposes in specific historical contexts. In medieval warfare, it offered warriors a way to die with honor rather than face capture and torture. In Edo, Japan, it helped maintain social order and resolve conflicts within the feudal system. In both periods, It reinforced samurai identity and the values of bushido. But as those contexts disappeared, as warfare changed, as the feudal system ended, as samurai became first bureaucrats and then historical memories, the need for seppuku faded. Its disappearance parallels the disappearance of the society that created it. The samurai world is gone. The values that made seppuku meaningful, though perhaps admirable in some abstract sense, don't map well onto modern life. We can study it, learn from it, even find aspects of it inspiring, but we can't, and probably shouldn't, try to revive it. Conclusion: the legacy of opening one's belly. We've traveled 8 centuries tonight, from Minamoto no Yorimasa composing his death poem before cutting himself open, through the 47 Ronin turning murder into immortality, to Yukio Mishima's body being carried out of a military headquarters while cameras captured everything. And if you remember how we started, with the promise that the truth about seppuku is stranger and more complex than the myths, I hope you now understand why. The romantic version tells you that samurai faced death with perfect serenity, that they opened their bellies without flinching, that they died surrounded by ceremony and honor. And sometimes, that was true. But just as often, kaishakunin missed their strikes. Men screamed despite centuries of training. The ritual that was supposed to transform death into art revealed itself as what it always was. People cutting themselves and each other with sharp blades, dying in pools of blood, suffering agony that no amount of philosophical framework could truly eliminate. The myths tell you seppuku was always voluntary, always honorable. But we've seen how it evolved into capital punishment, how men were ordered to die, how fan seppuku reduced the practice to symbolic theater. We've seen how social pressure made voluntary deaths feel anything but voluntary. The legends tell you it was about honor and loyalty, and it was. But it was also about maintaining social control, resolving political problems, and enforcing a hierarchy where only some lives were worth an honorable death. Here's what strikes me most though. Looking back across all these centuries, seppuku worked because people believed in it. Not everyone, not always, but enough people in positions of power believed that honor mattered more than life, that shame was worse than death, that loyalty should extend beyond the grave. And because they believed it, they built an entire infrastructure around it. They created rituals, wrote protocols, trained kaishakunin, composed death poems, preserved graves, told stories. They made ritual suicide meaningful. They took what could have been merely tragic and transformed it into something their culture celebrated. Whether we find that admirable or horrifying probably says more about us than about them. But here's the final twist I want to leave you with. Seppuku didn't end because people stopped being brave. It didn't end because modern Japanese are somehow less committed to principles than their ancestors. It ended because the world that made seppuku meaningful disappeared. When samurai ceased to be a social class, when feudal domains became modern prefectures, when the emperor became a symbol rather than a living god, when warfare became industrialized and impersonal, when honor became something you could maintain without dying, when all of that changed, seppuku lost its foundation. Mishima tried to bring it back, tried to prove the old values still mattered. And the soldiers laughed at him, not because they were cowards, but because they lived in a different world with different values. The framework that made ritual disembowelment seem not just reasonable, but admirable had crumbled. And without that framework, seppuku was just what it looked like: self-destruction dressed up in ceremony. The graves at Sengakuji Temple still receive visitors. People still burn incense for the 47 Ronin. Mishima's books still sell. The stories persist. But the practice is gone, and it's not coming back. Perhaps that's the best evidence that culture truly does evolve, that humanity can discard traditions no matter how deeply rooted, that what one era considers essential can become unthinkable to the next. We can study it. We can try to understand it. We can even, perhaps, find elements of the values that motivate it. Responsibility, loyalty, courage, that still resonate. But we can't revive it, and we probably shouldn't want to. Seppuku tells us something profound about human nature. We can create meaning out of anything, even death, even pain, even violence. We can build entire philosophies around practices that seem incomprehensible to outsiders. We can convince ourselves that certain actions, no matter how brutal, are not just acceptable, but admirable. And eventually, we can let them go. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most challenging practices valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel. We don't shy away from difficult topics. We try to understand rather than simply judge, to explore rather than condemn. Hit that like button if this exploration resonated with you, and let us know in the comments what other historical practices or events you'd like us to examine with the same depth and nuance. The past is never simple. The people who lived it were never purely heroes or villains, and the practices they followed, even the ones that disturb us most, made sense to them within their world. Understanding that doesn't mean approving it. It just means being honest about the full complexity of human history. Thank you for staying with this long, challenging journey through 8 centuries of ritual suicide. Sleep well. And remember, the strangest thing about history isn't how different people were from us. It's how much they were just like us, trying to create meaning and dignity in a world that offered neither automatically. Until next time, rest easy, knowing that some questions don't have comfortable answers, and that's okay. The past teaches us not just by what it got right, but by what it got wrong. Sweet dreams.